a panel for fantasy discussion, where we've come in, I'm going to say 60 years, but we just discussed that my math stinks. And it's a lot longer than 50 years. And which book did you point out, Josh?
Oh, I was talking about The Hobbit and when it was written, but even before that, I was talking about The Princess and the Goblin, which was written by, what was his name?
George MacDonald.
Yeah, back in the 1800s, and he was actually Tolkien's inspiration to write.
I've never heard of this person. I feel
The Princess and the Goblin is like the best.
He wrote a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I was being sharp with The Worm of Orboros. That was released around the same time, and Tolkien's awesomeness completely drowned out The Worm of Orboros, so a lot of people don't know about it. So I thought I was on top of my stuff with that. I'm like, all right. And then, yeah.
See, I've actually heard of that, but I've never read it before.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet either. Yeah, no, shame on me too. We can all be shamed together. So.
Well, I tried to read it, and it's no Lord of the Rings. So.
all of my fantasy, I'm very new, recent fantasy, so I'm still trying to backlog. Yes, I read Lord of the Rings, the Belgrade. I read a few of that. But a lot of the stuff I read is very contemporary, and sometimes it's real fun to go back and see kind of where fantasy has come from.
So I have to ask, where do you stand on the Patrick Rothfuss conversation?
I am pro Rothfuss. I am amazed at how divisive the universe is, because
the universe was gorgeous. I had a serious issue with book 2.
Which one? Like everyone.
Which problem?
Yeah.
I envisioned this very old man. I don't know, of our group here, has anyone read Patrick Rothfuss aside from Weech? Patrick Rothfuss he won a contest, and he was scooped up because he won this writing contest, and they published him. He was huge, New York Times bestseller, and it took him 4 years to write book 2. That was 7 years ago. I think it was 7 years ago. How long has it been? We are still waiting for book 3. It's a trilogy called The King Killer Chronicles. And we are still waiting for his 3rd book. And there's no book.
Have you seen the cover? Because that's out.
The cover's finally, I thought he gave up writing. Because there were a lot of people who were downright, I was one of them, merciless about book 2. And the world is gorgeous. I felt like it was Harry Potter meets Tolkien. It really had imagine Harry Potter, but the whole book revolved around Malfoy and Harry's rivalry. To me, that's what I walked away with the book. Book 1 was gorgeous. Book 2 was a serious disappointment. And then waiting 5 to 7 years for the book. But go ahead.
I'm still a huge fan of the series. I hear people and I hear their complaints, and they're not invalid because opinions, but the scope of the world, and really, especially when you get into first person narrative, what's going on, as long as Quoth is there, and I love Quoth, I'm going to love the series. I'm really forgiving of other issues as long as that main character is compelling, and it's just a masterful job that Rothfuss did.
Yeah, I think that's the difference. I do not like Quoth. I hate him. Yep. There's so much about Quoth I do not like.
There are people who are so Rothfuss is amazing. I love Quoth. This is great. And then there are people who just hate it. But it's true, and it's indicative of first person. If you buy off on the main character, then the series is going to do well. But if you can't sell the main character, then you don't stand a chance.
Now you're comparing it against the original, the classic fantasies, going back to what Tolkien did, and Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and Edison. How do you feel it stands up?
The first thing I noticed, and I think the greatest distinction between classic fantasy, if you want to coin that phrase, and modern fantasy is the desire for the systems of magic to be more based on logical rules.
How's everyone else on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There's a line that is much more science fiction. Science fiction is much closer to fantasy now than in the past. Whereas before it was a lot easier to simply say magic. It's magic.
Yeah.
And I think that part of that is bringing it into our world, is urban fantasy, which is so large now. And I think that we want to see logically why something's occurring, and we're not quite so prepared to simply go along with something. And there must be a payoff, I think, as a reader for the downside for magic, or the downside for, there are limitations to it, there are the reasons behind it, and there's also going to be something damaging. So we kind of know that if a certain amount of energy is expended on that, there's also going to be consequences, and it's also going to be a damaging. And I think that in the past, the line was a lot, there was a greater difference between science fiction and fantasy, but also you didn't have to do that in the same way. And and absolutely, I think also we have so many different genres, genres of fantasy, and subgenres within the genres, and it just gets categorized. And I think obviously before you didn't. I mean, and that is the biggest difference.
One of the things you said that really, really hit home with me was we have to logically explain it now. You can't have it just because. And that brings me to Shakespeare very, very briefly. He had the character, I cannot remember the character, Prince John, I want to say, and that's not it. In Much Ado About Nothing, the villain was a villain because he was the villain, he was evil, and he just had to do something evil. And
I think it was Iago.
Iago.
Oh, Othello is one of the greatest works.
It wasn't Othello. It's Much Ado About Nothing.
Yeah.
Iago's from Othello. It was the villain in Much Ado About Nothing, and he gave this whole speech in Much Ado About Nothing about how evil he was, and because he was evil, he was driven to do evil things. And we were satisfied with that in the 1500s. We didn't. Okay, he's evil. Story away.
Yeah.
And today that's not okay. Now there has to be this complicated psychological background. There has to be justification for it. And now I have to go back on Iago and see if he also had the same lack of motive. Just, I'm evil, ergo.
Iago was given a very thin motive. He was passed over for promotion.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
He had a history with the I can't remember the captain of general's name. Like they were brothers, I think.
Yeah.
And he
Michael.
passed over, and he decided he wanted to wreck everybody's romances, and that worked for the setup because the focus wasn't really on the characters. The focus was on the comedy and the comedic, but and also the tension between honor and love and duty and all of that, and the play on words, and that was where the focus was. But now in today's fiction, it's so focused on character and psychology and rules. And I think Harry Potter had a lot to do with that in just those large world rules and the reasons and wherefores to how we kind of got to where fantasy is today.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that built up to that, which Tolkien did, is he finally got fantasy out of the dream world or out of the dream sequence, so that we were no longer seeing fantastical worlds just being in the course of dreams, whether you're talking about Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures in Wonderland or H.P. Lovecraft's like Dream Cycle. What Tolkien did is he brought it into an actual world that they were physically, or his characters were physically living within. And over time, we've seen our world and fantasy worlds blend more and more and more until I think we've gotten to a place where there's now urban fantasy.
Yeah, very much so.
That makes sense.
Yeah. No, there really is an evolution that's taken place over the last, about 100 years now, where it went from a very, and I'm going to mention it, Firefly, the mentality of the fantasy realm. And nerd, thank you.
Firefly so much.
It was very much not acceptable. I remember Black Cauldron by Disney came out, and I'm sorry, that gave us a really bad rap. And it was not taken seriously. Fantasy was a whole nother thing, a whole nother creature that and it really has taken a massive hit of acceptance. And you saw that resistance when they canceled the show Firefly. Whenever something did come up, it was almost like it was the genre reserved for a very, very small group of people. We're going to put it in the corner there and pretend it doesn't exist. And something happened in the last 10 years, even 15 years, where it just exploded. The nerd took over.
Game of Thrones on HBO just took over the world.
Yeah. And I remember, go ahead.
I was shocked that of all the people who read the books and knew that the Red Wedding was coming, nobody said anything. All these people across the world were shocked when the Red Wedding happened on TV, and everybody who read the book said, well, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
but nobody said anything ahead of time. The self-control was amazing.
I think it was Susanna that had a great point. Mm-hmm. You look at what some might call bridge books, and Harry Potter was a bridge book because it brought fantasy to the youth, and the youth grew up with Harry Potter.
Yeah.
You have Game of Thrones, and you have these series of books that started coming out. 1990 was kind of a big year for fantasy, or at least the beginning of that decade. And as people started growing up, and then when Harry Potter came out, you're looking at people who were at worst lukewarm to fantasy, and then they're just giving their kids something to read.
Yeah.
And when that blew up, fantasy became the cool thing.
Yeah. And that's really right there. You hit it on the head. It's a bridge book. Can you imagine the Lord of the Rings movies, Game of Thrones being made prior to Harry Potter? They would just not stand for it.
Well, like they'd always have these obligatory, like Dragonheart came out when I was like a little kid. So you'd have like the niche audience. They'd fork out a couple $1,000s and call that their fantasy movie for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
And now they can't get enough of it.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I think we shouldn't downplay Tolkien's influence too much, because in the 70s, it really influenced a lot of rock that was coming out, and a lot of kind of like a cult following grew up around it. And I think that set the stage for things like Harry Potter and stuff like that, but it wasn't as loud as Harry Potter, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well. Yeah.
I mean, Harry Potter was based on pretty much everything that came before. It just came, these books that come are the zeitgeist. They're just there at the right time. Mm-hmm. And that's what it did. I mean, it's a bit like, Neil Gaiman, who, for urban fantasy fans, he, and those of us that grew up with it, it was on the BBC. It was shown on the TV. It was shown on the TV. And I think almost all urban fantasy authors were influenced by him, and British ones, when we grew up watching it on TV. And to be able to see these supernatural creatures, but underneath the everyday, that was just not what fantasy was like. And that just absolutely blew my mind. And it's the reason I wanted to become a fantasy author as opposed to a different kind of author.
Yeah.
Or a science fiction straight author. So I think that his influence as well is really important. But I think that Harry Potter is almost a case of, well, it was a case of just absolutely being the right person at the right time, zeitgeist in so many different parts of culture, as opposed to no down whatever on Harry Potter in any way, as everyone must always say. As opposed to it being a better or a different book, it was just one of those perfect storm, perfect moment things.
Yeah, no, that's perfect storm. No, that's
well, and I think its timing makes a lot of sense. I completely agree with Rosemary. I mean, I'm an 80s child, and when I look at what the culture was like in the 80s, it was, my entire childhood was fantasy movies. I remember whether it was cartoons or regular movies, it was Dragons, it was He-Man. There was, of course, Dungeons and Dragons that was going wild. I mean, I've been playing since Dungeons and Dragons 2.0 was out, and I was there before that as well. It's continuously been a part of our culture for the last 20 years, and we've constantly seen fantasy become more and more part of our reality. It was only about time for urban fantasy to take off, or contemporary fantasy, or whatever we want to categorize Harry Potter as being.
Yeah. No, Pirates of the Caribbean, again, 80s child, and I remember when it came up, there was a definite, I was starved for it. And I grew up in a Christian home. It was absolutely strict. I was allowed to watch Little Mermaid, and I was very fortunate to watch Little Mermaid because of the sea witch. But I had a lot of friends who, well, sea witches, no, you're not allowed. The same people aren't allowed to touch Harry Potter. So there was a lot of repression happening over the fantasy elements. And I remember hungry for it, starving for it. So when Pirates of the Blackwater came out, I think that cartoon ran a whopping 2 years. If not, I don't even think it made it through its second year. And it was it was beyond dragons. And I think that's it right there. Tolkien, there was a lot of dragons. You have that image of the wizard fighting the Balrog for so long. That was the only fantasy that we saw. And then it started in the 80s, we started to see Dungeons and Dragons come out, a little bit more of that fantasy, and the world got a lot bigger. But there was a lot that was just constantly stomping it down. And I think, yeah, when Harry Potter came along, it finally hit that perfect storm where we finally got beyond the dragons. That's
it. You got to remember, too, Tolkien was popular in England for almost 20 years before it got popular over in the United States. And so we were a little slow on the upkeep and catching up with what they were doing. But once it came over, yeah, it just took off like wildfire.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, this was, as far as the reflections of the fantasy, one of the things that I loved doing when the Lord of the Rings movies came out, I was one of those morons who sat there and watched all 1 week worth of the making of Lord of the Rings. I know more stuff about that than I ever wanted. It's gross, some of the stuff I learned. And one of the things that they talked about was Tolkien and what his goal was and how much he hated allegory and some of the things that he pulled from his own experiences. And one of the things that came up, which ties into World War I and some of the research that I've done as far as the mentality of World War I, was he was in World War I in the trenches, and he witnessed what they had done to the horses. He had witnessed what they had done to machines and how machines were this vile thing taking over nature. And that was a huge part of his inspiration for the writers of Rohan, for the horse people in Rohan, and also the metaphor. And again, he hates allegory, so this is just, me coming up with crap. The metaphor of all this modernism in Isengard, destroying all the trees and taking them down with the machines and the genetic experimentation. And then, of course, the nature with the Ent March trumping over that and then washing away the filth in the machine with nature, with the water that came through. And then I did some research on, it was Warhorse actually that woke me up to what he had seen during World War I, the wake-up call. And that also ties into what I saw with MASH with World War I, and how when he emerged on the scene back in the 30s with Hobbit and then later on with Lord of the Rings, he had a very definitive, not a fantastical view from the author's point of view. It was just very simply, he saw this vile thing, the modern man, versus nature. And he took that and ran with it. And somehow, in all of that, he came up with the orcs. He came up with the goblins, the elves. It was just interesting to see how that emerged and how that experience that he had just kickstarted and fed this genre. And I think it's still there. At the end of the day, fantasy is still, Final Fantasy, we see it, where there's that core base of nature versus the machine, versus the modern.
I think fantasy will always be the genre that is free to be comparative in a world that doesn't exist, that goes into extremes of society. I think you'll always see cultural issues, societal issues, evolutionary issues explored in fantasy first, because it gives the reader and the audience a very thin veil of separation. But because you're looking at a world that can't possibly exist, you're more willing to face some of the issues that fantasy kind of brings against people, whether it be anti-war, anti-industry, whatever issues that they approach, people are more willing to accept it. And then once fantasy breaks down that door, once fantasy gives you that comparison, then the other genres start to get a little more brave. They're like, well, they got away with it. What can we try?
I totally
Star
agree.
Trek was the first TV show
Which one?
to have an interracial kiss. Star Trek was the first TV show to have an interracial kiss.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No.
I think both fantasy and sci-fi both do this brilliantly. And I call myself a subversive artist, which is just a posh way of saying what we're all saying. It's this ability to challenge, because you can challenge these sort of small lies that society say, whether it's that you're boring if you're older, or that money makes you happy, or that a disabled person can't be successful, or whatever these things are. You're able to challenge them because there is that little bit of divide that isn't there in the other genres. But you can do it because it's, whether it's sci-fi or it's fantasy, it is in a different world or a different realm or whatever. And you can be a lot more truthful in the actual way that you do that, and a lot braver in some ways that you can do that, and a lot more mainstream about the way that you actually do that. And that means that I think some of the most challenging fiction out there is within sci-fi and is within fantasy.
I totally agree with what you're saying, and Weech as well. I've had people ask me many times why I write fantasy, and it's for that exact reason. It gives me a platform to teach readers and teach society about topics that they're not willing to talk about openly in other venues. And that's what I love about fantasy. I mean, we always joke that everything I learned about life, I learned from playing D&D, and it's very true, because you get to explore a lot of things that you didn't really get to explore in real life by playing D&D. It's the same reason that I loved reading Terry Goodkind or R.A. Salvatore or any of those other wonderful fantasy authors growing up.
Do you think because it's low fantasy versus high fantasy that either one of those maybe addresses it differently than the other? One maybe executes it better than the other?
I think high fantasy tends to look at big pictures and large vistas, whereas lower fantasy tends to be more concerned with minutia, I suppose. I think that it might be easier to address certain things through low fantasy than it would be through high fantasy, because I think in high fantasy there's so much action and big stakes that it could drown out a quiet message. That you can't give a big message through a high fantasy, but that it's easier to give a kind of a quieter message through low, if that makes any sense.
The journey. Every fantasy, and I'm curious if you feel it's still the same expectation. When you pick up a fantasy, there are certain elements you expect to see. And at the core of that is the magic. There has to be magic. And if there's no magic, don't call it fantasy. What about the epic journey? That long Frodo's journey, Harry's journey to his defeat, or his victory, I should say. Is that a trademark?
I think it's a trademark. I think it's an expectation, but I think it's beginning to become something people are starting to rebel against. I think that's why you see the rise of the anti-hero stories coming out. Mm-hmm. So I'm a huge fan of it. It's one of the greater arcs, but as much as it is, and still has a lot of your greater stories will have that hero's journey story arc. But I'm starting to see more and more people kind of rebel against that in little ways, and sooner or later someone's gonna catch the right wave, mm-hmm. and rail against that, and find a different arc that isn't your typical hero's journey. It's going to be a different angle toward a climax that we haven't seen.
Yeah. I'm obviously that rebel. Well, I write the anti-hero. So it's interesting. There's definitely no epic journey. You still have the things that you would expect to find within a book structure-wise, although I play with narrative form still. But I think you have to know this idea of the 60 years, which I find interesting, because you have to know what's come before in order to go about reinventing it or doing something different. So I deliberately wanted to do something different. But no, I like the idea that there are books that are going to have that epic journey. There's always going to be a place for that, and I'm always going to want to read that. But I do like the idea of always having reinvention and always having something new. And I love anti-heroes. So I love that anti-hero form. And I do love the idea of fantasy always changing and always having new things within fantasy.
I think that's what makes fantasy amazing, though, because fantasy is that the readers of fantasy and fans of fantasy, they want new but same. Like they want as much of the elements that they know with a twist, and it's always just a twist that they want, because they have the common ideals that they hold on to and the common ideals that they love. But it's those guys that come at it and just give you that one slight or that one slant, and that's why anti-heroes are so successful. And then providing a different plot twist. But I think it terrifies fantasy authors too, because you're sitting there and go, this is really different. And it's either going to go very well for you or not. Like, I don't know, who do you guys credit for the first real urban fantasy person? Because that guy was really, or woman was very, very courageous.
Oh, I think it's Neil Gaiman.
Marvel Comics.
Yeah.
I always thought that Whedon's Buffy was kind of one of the earliest. Yeah, I'm rewatching Buffy right now, so I have Buffy on the brain. I have Spike running around in my head.
Yes.
Lucky you.
And I think Spike might have been one of the earliest anti-heroes, and I really think the anti-hero is just a twist on the redemption story. I think
that's beautifully said. Yeah.
I think that as through every decade, fantasy kind of reinvents itself because society is constantly in a flux, and I think people are in a place now where they want to read a story where even when somebody looks like somebody has crossed the line, they can come back at least a little bit from that line, and I think the anti-hero is kind of the symbol of that.
I'm going to pull right back to Golem and Frodo's relationship. At the end of the day, you could almost say that Golem was the anti-hero. And that's when Frodo, and I'm just pulling this stuff out of my butt right now, so don't mind me. When Frodo looked at Golem and very much saw his own potential future with that adamant, he can be saved, he can go back. That wasn't about Golem. That was very much about if Golem can't come back, then if I were to go down that road, I can't come back. So yes, Golem can come back. And I definitely, that right there in itself, it's almost like when Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, he had that epic journey, he had that classic ideal. He also had a little bit of that, the anti-hero in there as well. He was pulling from both worlds. One from what was happening and the other from what would happen later.
Well, I think Tolkien, because of his Catholic background, was a great believer in redemption, and that because in the biblical story, the reason why Judas ends up committing suicide is because he turns his back on the cross. He thinks he's gone too far, that he can't ask for redemption, and so that Judas character is sort of in Gollum, and Tolkien's kind of raising the question that, Gollum can come back and be Smeagol again if he grasps that redemption, and that's really what that whole anti-hero thing is.
Mm-hmm.
Something Angela touched on is one thing you can't deny, and I think it's one of the more underrated things that Tolkien did, is the idea of interweaving plot threads. A lot of pre-Tolkien, a lot of other stories are very, very one-dimensional. And once you started going in there, and the main character wasn't necessarily the main character, there are still arguments over whether or not Frodo is even the main character of Lord of the Rings. And when you start interweaving plots and giving readers other characters to follow, you're broadening the scope of the story, and I think that's one of the greater contributions Tolkien gave us, is that broader scope, the sense of perspective, the ideal that the other characters in a story are they themselves main characters in their own smaller stories.
And that each character is important in reaching whatever the goal is of achieving whatever. I mean, you have that scene in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo can't go any further, so Sam picks him up. And there's that wonderful line of, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you, which makes me cry a little.
Yeah, I'm right there.
I'm tearing up right now. Oh my gosh.
No, it's because of that Sam is my favorite character.
Yes,
like
yes, I love
to
Sam.
me, it's about Sam. Which is why the book ends with Sam saying, "I'm back." It is about Sam. To me, it's not about Hero. It's his journey. And I'm curious, has anyone here read the Silmarillion?
Yes. Yeah.
I haven't.
It reads like the Genesis and Ulysses. It is gorgeous, absolutely beautiful, and I'm eager to see what they're doing with the movies. So I have to ask, pulling it onto Silmarillion, just a brief. I'm trying to figure out how to brief Silmarillion. It revolves around 3 jewels that are made from 2 trees, and when the jewels are taken, there's a massive catastrophe that happens, and the jewels are lost. These jewels are such in beauty that the main hero, the creator of the gems, vows that he and his kin are bound to these jewels, and it's a blood vow, very similar to what you see in Harry Potter, and that until the jewels are returned to his family, they will not. They are driven to look for these jewels, and his action within a page, he does a very horrible, heinous act that the gods rise up and curse the jewels. That anyone who hunts these jewels will in turn be plagued by a curse. So the whole story is watching how this family, after generation, they're bound by this vow and haunted by this curse. It's intense. So, and there's so many more heroes and fantasy that comes into this on such a really, Silmarillion makes Lord of the Rings look like a joke. It is so huge. And I'm curious, for those who have read Silmarillion, who do you think is the anti-hero in Silmarillion? Small question.
I got nothing.
Nothing.
I got nothing.
For me, it was
Well,
Fëanor.
For me, what drew me into Silmarillion was I immediately latched on to the origin and the creation cycle. So I was reading more of the Genesis angle, and so I latched on to the like the guy who was singing a song that was different from the rest of the choir.
Yeah.
Or the language, because it just doesn't read as if it's written by the same author almost. To me, it's not. You're not. For me, it's Lord of the Rings is about the characters and the emotions, whereas it's more as if it's a book about language.
Yeah, for me, Silmarillion was written for Tolkien. He absolutely wrote this for himself. It was the book he wanted. Whereas Lord of the Rings was, okay, here's a little fraction of what I put together, because you asked. He wrote The Hobbit for himself, and I saw a lot more of Silmarillion related to Hobbit than I did Lord of the Rings. Same thing with the children. I can't remember the name of it right now. The children of
Hurin.
Yes, the children of Hurin.
Yeah.
And
that's what I was thinking about was Turin. What's his last name? Like Turambar or something like that. He's in the Children of Hurin, but he's also in the Silmarillion, and he's an anti-hero.
Yeah.
That's who first came to my mind.
Yeah. No, Fëanor.
But I think you're right. I think that Fëanor is the main anti-hero in Silmarillion.
Yeah. And when I read it, to me, Fëanor was a victim. And I don't know if that's horrible of me or not. To me, he was absolutely a victim, poisoned very much by the Silmaril. And I never saw him as, I totally dismissed his responsibility in all of it. So probably horrible of me, but.
So if you don't mind, Angela, I wanted to go back to what we were talking about a little bit ago about how fantasy has evolved and how Tolkien introduced different perspectives from different characters, because I think that's a huge evolvement that's happened in fantasy in modern age, especially with George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. We not only have multiple viewpoints of characters, but we have multiple motivations, so that it's difficult to see who's right and who's wrong, who's good and who's evil. And so we've taken out a lot of this, flip of a coin, right and wrong type of thing, and now it's a lot of shades of gray. all over the place. And so I think that fantasy is really taking a turn where there's less of this light versus dark in novels and more of multiple perspectives where the reader's struggling to figure out who they agree with.
Yeah, and I've seen that a lot with some of the anime I'm watching. One of the characters, I can't tell which side he's on. It's definitely fantasy, but he flips so fast. One episode, he's the good guy. The other episode, he's the bad guy. And that is something I think more than ever that's coming into question, is trying to figure out who the antagonist and who the protagonist is.
That's what, absolutely. I mean, that's what I like. That's why I write dark fantasy. And I write about anti-heroes. That's my preference, is to write about anti-heroes. But you never know if the heroes in my book are actually the heroes or the bad guys when you're reading the story. Because their motivations seem just as righteous as what the bad guys' motivations are. And so at the end of it, I don't even know if we won.
Yeah, no, very much. One of my favorite characters in all books, all stories ever, is, I'm going to call him a bad guy, but I really don't know. I've seen him do some pretty bad things. I've seen him do some pretty good things for the wrong reasons, and I've seen him do some pretty bad things for the right reasons. There's nothing predictable about this character. The only thing I am certain of is whatever he decides, he absolutely has something for himself in mind. And I don't think that's bad, the way they're portraying it. And he's got to be one of my favorite characters, who constantly, every time he's on the screen, I'm just like, what's he going to do next? Because you don't know if he's good or bad. And my kids are all at that age where every time we sit down and watch a movie, no matter what genre, they have to identify the antagonist. There's something, and I have a 9-year-old. It doesn't matter. I have to know who the bad guy is, and I have to know who to cheer for. I'm curious if you have that, if you have that with your children. They got to know who that bad guy and the good guy is.
Yes.
And I've told them, you can't, that's an opinion. I'm not going to tell you, you try and figure it out. And it drives them crazy to watch a show and they go, well, I got to know, who do I root for? And leaving them to that, it's really, and it's getting harder with a lot of the villains that are coming out. It's getting a lot harder to figure out what side everyone is on. That you're right, it is getting way too gray to see just where that ethical is.
And even for Tolkien, it's pretty clear. I mean, Sauron's the bad guy because he wants to destroy everything, and so it's very clear. But he's almost chaotic evil in the way that he's doing it, in the way that his approach is. But you don't see that. I mean, Game of Thrones, for a long time, you're like, I don't even know who's right and who's wrong. Everybody has, even Jaime Lannister or whatever. I mean, he has a good heart, but he does a lot of bad things.
Joff was evil. Sorry.
Okay, yes.
Sorry. He was evil. Well, I didn't watch the show, but I know that.
And
I'm having a lot of fun with it. Go ahead, Stephen.
I think it was, I got the quote up on my board over here, but it's too dark for me to read it. But somebody once said that everyone is the hero of their own story. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now in movies and books, regardless a lot of times of the genre, of portraying everybody as the hero of their own story. They honestly think they're doing the right thing, whatever that thing is. And so that's just pulling the audience into that person's perspective is, I think, really what's graying the moral spectrum. And it's really fascinating to see, and I think, again, it's a reflection on our own society where right and wrong have become really relative. And it just varies person to person a lot of times. And so, we're all the heroes of our own story.
But this is a consequence of Tolkien opening up scope. It was only natural that eventually someone wanted to see the bad guy's point of view. So we talked about wanting deeper villains. It's not enough for us anymore for a guy to just want to destroy the world because I wear a black hat. It's evolved. And the minute you opened up the scope, people wanted to understand the motivations of the villains. And the more people understand one another, the harder it is to really identify what they're after is right or wrong. It could be something as mundane as two people going after the same job. And what are you willing to do to get the job that someone else isn't? And how does the reader affiliate with them? So once that door got cracked open and people started deciding to let others into to the motivations of those behind it, it was only natural that people then demand to be able to understand why? What is he after? What's going on? Why is he doing this evil thing? When those characters weren't essential to the story, all we wanted to do was see the good guy conquer. A lot of I want to mention Brent Weeks here. I think he did it so beautifully in the Night Angel trilogy, not just with the villain, but in I'm trying to remember the character's name, but he starts out as this seer. He's the evil king's son, and he takes over the throne. And as he progresses, he begins making decisions that make so much sense to him. And when you start to understand what your reasoning is, it's up to the individual to decide whether or not those things are evil, because everyone has to decide where their line is.
And that's all it there, isn't it? It's decisions. Yeah. And as a writer, that's what you do. You're basically making your character each time make the decisions based on what those motivations are. Yeah. And when you act, you're doing that. You're finding the motivations. And it doesn't matter who you are. We talked about Shakespeare earlier and the Othello, whoever. And you are trying to find what the character loves. And if you do that, you can be the worst villain, but you will make the audience sympathize with them. And it used to be a little bit of a game that we do, is that we would try and make the audience love us more than the hero. But and you've done it, and that's what you're trying to do. And I think that's what you're trying to do in your books as well.
I'm going to pull on the world's worst villain, Dolores Umbridge. I don't know about any of you, but I never once gave a crap why that woman was the way she was. There was nothing. I didn't want a deeper meaning. I didn't want to understand her. I wanted her dead. And
but if you've been to see a really good play where there's a really good actor, mm-hmm. and they're playing supposedly the bad guy, but you find yourself watching them more and worrying to see what their reaction will be when something happens, that's because they found the gold and they found the motivation that's made you do that. And sometimes in books, people do the same trick on you with a supposed bad guy or the supposed really bad anti-hero, or that's the kind of trick you're pulling. It's the same thing.
That's like what Tom Hiddleston did with Loki in the Marvel movies. Loki is supposed to be this chaotic character, and here it comes in the Avengers movie. He's in New York, and he's destroying New York. He's essentially putting thousands of lives in danger and everything. And yet, at the same time, because you saw the first Thor movie, you kind of know where his pain is coming from. You understand that he's pretty much got a broken psyche, and he's just trying to, make his own mark, find out who he is, and be true to himself, all the while having been told most of his life that his self is bad. And so he's trying to live up, I guess, to the expectation that others have put on him. And so I guess that's one of the reasons why Loki has made such a compelling character. But example,
women really like looking at Tom Hiddleston.
Yeah.
Why was it going to be that?
I'm just going to put it right where it is. If Tom Hiddleston had like a cleft chin and slanted eyeballs, I don't know how much sympathy we'd have. But he's a brilliant actor. I'll do credit.
We are ready to forgive his character. There's no question about it. If he were to repent and turn a new leaf, we'd be right there going, yep, okay, yeah, he's good again. We don't care. He can do no wrong. We are already ready to forgive him. And it's funny because Dolores Umbridge, there was zero forgiveness. We did not care.
But see, I would argue that made Dolores a better villain, because no matter what Dolores did, there's no redemption for her. We don't care.
She's one-dimensional and she's evil. So
we see the same thing. We see the same thing with Negan in The Walking Dead. You can't keep your eyes off of it when you're watching it. You're just waiting to see what he's going to do next. Every time somebody steps out of line, how's he going to respond? And your eyes are glued to the screen, waiting for it.
Absolutely.
I think that's Negan is a good transition into the role of villains in fantasy, which has evolved, and what villains do in certain books. Some villains are designed to be the guy they fight at the end. Some villains are designed to teach us about the hero, and some villains are only there to intimidate the readers about what might happen or where they might go. And villains have evolved amazingly in fantasy, and it's very satisfying to see where authors take villains, because there's so much potential for what they could do for a story.
I have to add this because this is really, Has anyone here seen the Batman Lego movie? Okay, I'm going to do
I'm a
this.
child at heart.
I'm going to do this. I've seen it twice. It's so epic. I'm going to do this without any spoilers. So forgive me if I'm a little slow getting this out. There is a moment where Batman's core is questioned. Is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? And they start to evaluate what is a good guy and what is a bad guy. And that question really, now clearly, without question, when you start that conversation, it's, oh, well, he's a good guy because it's Batman. He's you know, Joker's bad, he's good. But they start to roll the tape, and the more they roll the tape, the more you go, no, he's the bad guy. He's a bad guy. He's a confused bad guy. So it's really interesting. And Iron Man has the same problem, and I am not gonna say it, but Iron Man has the same problem where he's a good guy, but he is really messed up. I mean, really, and where does that, what makes a good guy good, what makes a bad guy bad? And you've got a lot of really top-notch good guys making some really crappy decisions, bad decisions. And what's interesting is we look at Frodo, and he's very much innocent, small, and he is the epitome of the underdog. And then you have today's bad guy, and I think this is really where there's most of the change happening, is today's bad guy is no more a let's root for the underdog. Now it's a how can I relate to this character? Well, I've got 18 million flaws, and Frodo doesn't have any flaws. He's a hobbit, and he's perfect, so how can I relate to that? Whereas we are relating a lot more to the Iron Mans and the Batmans. And it's really interesting how... One of the things that I keep going over is we're talking about wanting a deeper reason than, oh, well, he's just wearing a black hat. But why are we wanting a deeper reason? What are we looking for that we are going back over and over again?
I think you ask what is good and what is bad. And I think what is good and what is bad is oftentimes a reflection of society. Society's the mirror back on the person on what's acceptable. And I think as authors or writers, what we're doing is we're trying to capture the current mindset of society in our own writings in order to teach people about themselves in the direction that they're going.
So my question is, does Tolkien still have a place in our society? Is it still relatable?
Well, sure. You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been.
And I think Tolkien touches on a lot of archetypes and myths and things that still relate to us, because all of us want to see triumph and to prevent of bad things from happening, and we all want to see the underdog win, and us all to be able to live to see another day, and I think for courage to prevail, and so it has all those virtues and things in it that are timeless, and I think that's what makes Tolkien timeless and influential even today.
And also important to the relatability of the character is the temptation of power. Every single character, even in the end Frodo, was ultimately seduced by power, and even the heroic act of Gollum at the end was an act of selfishness that resulted in a heroic ending. And so when people start breaking it down, that temptation, growing up, I affiliated with Boromir a lot. Yeah. Because you look at a guy and he's just trying to find an edge. He's just trying to find an advantage. And he saw an obstacle between potential safety for his kingdom. So I would say that there's a lot of relatability in that, because everyone understands, what would I really do with power?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really where Tolkien is different from today. Is back then it was you have somebody who is that smaller character, that innocent, and they're being tempted with power. Today, like in Iron Man in the Marvel comics, you are very much you have that power. It's in your possession. And now it's a question of what are you going to do with it? It's beyond the temptation. They already have it. They've already wielded it. They're already playing God on so many different levels. One of them is a God. And they're no longer being tempted with it. Now they're going, do I have the right? Am I really going this far with it? And one of the things that I love looking into is Iron Man and Bruce Banner's character when they get their hands on the Age of Ultron. And they're already gods. They're already playing on that power trip, and both of them are constantly manipulating power, and they're pushing that limit. And they take it to a whole nother level with the Age of Ultron, where it's gods now playing gods. And that's it really, but you don't see Frodo doing that. Frodo's, he still remains intact. It's whether or not he's going to surrender to power. Whereas today, they're already there. They're already corrupt. And now it's a matter of how they're going to reel that in.
But interestingly, I think Tolkien in his own way thought that he was dealing with the same issue, because from his perspective, as you were saying, he'd been through the Great War, and he was going for the Second World War, and that was the first time there'd been that kind of mechanized slaughter. So tanks were new, and it was kind of beyond anything that people now had seen. And so in a kind of strange way, he was writing about pretty much the same thing. And although we're concentrating very much on Frodo, as we're talking about all the other characters around, because it's about so many different other characters, Gandalf himself, they're all dealing with, they could almost be sitting around deciding, are they going to press the button on the bomb? It's not that different, whether it's the rings or whether it's the riders who've all succumbed, who used to be kings, and they've all succumbed to the power. And Gandalf saying, don't give the ring to me because it will tempt me. They already know that could be, it's a dangerous weapon that they couldn't have. And I do think that you as a writer are massively impacted by what you go through. I know he refused to say that, he was always furious and saying, look, if it's just an orc, it's an orc, it's just an elf, it's an elf, and all this. But no, obviously it did. So I think that in a strange kind of way, he was pretty much saying exactly the same thing, particularly about power and war.
Yeah, I think we all struggle with the same issues throughout, struggling with power and temptation and things from our past. Going back to the Marvel, Captain Rogers, that dream sequence in Age of Ultron when the Scarlet Witch is messing with everybody's head, and he has that kind of hallucination or dream about being in that dance hall, and it's twisted because it's supposed to dance, but everybody in conflict with each other. The lipstick looks like blood, and the dancers look like fighting, and it's all about Steve's fear that he can never leave war, that he will never be able to leave it behind, and I think that that's a fear that's you could that's present in any age of people who have gone to war. Do they ever really leave it? And Tolkien was probably struggling with that through the Lord of the Rings. Did he ever really leave that war?
Yeah. And that goes back to the scoring of the Shire, which I'm so glad they cut that out of the movie, and I'm so glad they did that ode to it with the Palantir. Okay, I think that's Harry Potter, but no, it's not Harry Potter. I'm getting my movies crossed. When he looks in Galadriel's mirror and he sees the scoring of the Shire, it was such a horrible ending. To me, it was just everything that he happened, everything that Frodo went through, everything he lost, and then he gets home and it's Sauron is there and he's absolutely destroyed the Shire. It was almost as if I spent the whole movie, and I'm curious if anyone else had this feeling when they read the book. You spend the whole book knowing that he's fighting for the Shire, and at the end of it all, the Shire is going to be unharmed, waiting for him. But then he gets there and the Shire isn't there. It's destroyed, it's burnt, it's absolutely, there's blood, it's horrible. And it's almost as if he took the happy ending I just read 1,400 pages to get to, and he shredded it It was really, I'm curious if anyone else had that preservation of the Shire through the whole story.
I think that's, I mean, you're writing about you're writing about war, so it's only natural for the author of this series to make sure that he makes the point that no matter what happens, war touches everyone. Like no one, it inevitably gets everyone anyway.
But I wanted my happy ending.
Me too, but I can't not, like, I'm still a huge fan. Like, I get a lot, the biggest raging I get against Bob Drifter is he's such a good guy. And I'm like, what's wrong with good guys? What's wrong with a guy that'll hold a door open for a woman? Or what's wrong with the guy that truly just wants to be right? And sometimes I think we rail against it for the sake of railing against it. I would have been more satisfied with coming home to a pristine home, but that's not what Tolkien's books are about.
And I think
I personally,
I think that the happy ending wasn't really meant to be in the Shire, because Frodo, after having gone through everything, could not return truly to the Shire, because at the very end of the book, he gets into the ship with the rest of the elves and he goes across the sea, and I think that was the happy ending.
I had a problem with that part too.
I think what Tolkien was trying to say was that maybe you never really do return fully from war. You can't go back to your happy childhood. I think the Shire kind of represented Frodo's childhood and his innocence. Once you've gone through war, you can't ever really go back. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a bright, beautiful thing to go towards. And I think that's really what that ending was supposed to have been about.
I agree with Susanna. That's actually one of the things I loved about Tolkien, is that the Shire was destroyed. I think that was I thought it was a wonderful, gritty, realistic addition to fantasy, which again took it out of that dreamlike fantasy sequence and really brought it home for readers to see that, life isn't always, rainbows and unicorns. There are hard lessons to be learned in that. You can still pull something positive out of it. You can still find positivity out of it. There's still a happy ending. There's still a lesson to be learned, even despite the hardships you go through.
He lost a finger.
Don't read my books, Angela. You won't like. Sam was also able to rebuild it.
Yeah, and he skipped that part. Yeah, they did rebuild it, but they really did not. I was not satisfied. And I think that right there is why I stuck with Sam Moore, is because he got his gardens. And really, okay, this is about the gardens being destroyed, guys. So, the fact that you had Sam back, he had his children, he had his closure. I think that's why I clung to Sam a lot more, is because I saw the ending I wanted to see with Sam.
I think it's ironic in a discussion about how far fantasy has come over the last 60 years that we still go back to Tolkien.
Not necessarily. You have the reason we go back to Tolkien or we go back to C.S. Lewis is we have identifiable characters. We have people, even if we haven't experienced war, we've experienced our own quest, we've experienced our own lives that have had their own battles. So we can, the reason a good story stays a good story is because it speaks to our heart, no matter what language or no matter what age it's in.
Well, ultimately, great storytelling will always be great storytelling, and that's how you can tell the greats from the pretty goods to the mediocre. I think most people can hold an audience for about an hour and a half. But when you can hold an audience for 60 years, then you've really done something. When you can hold an audience for 30 years, you've really done something. And that's what we all aspire to be. We want to create things that people can continue to go back and revisit and love and enjoy, because that's the true litmus test for great storytelling.
Yeah, the 3 tests of classic literature. And it's
I think there's a lot.
Go ahead.
I think there's a lot to be said about our media too, and our technology, and how things have progressed since the 1940s, 1960s. I mean, and our parents, of course, teaching us things in it. And really, the last 20 years has just been an entire 2 decades of reboots. I mean, we haven't really done a whole lot of new things in 20 years. And so, I would like to think that in 60 more years, Tolkien is going to become that guy way back when that people used to talk about, and you're going to see new fantasy authors authors on the horizon that have offered something new and brought new scope to writing. We just aren't there yet.
And all I can see is that BBC special with the animated Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit. And then what they're doing today with the movies. And
in 60 years, we may have holographic movies. Who knows?
they can walk around us and we can interact with Frodo. That'll be interesting.
That's terrifying, actually.
Yeah.
I don't want to interact with
the old BBC movies we were watching today.
You can interact with the characters in the story, and that'll be really. I'm patenting that. That's really. that's really. Gollum jumps through you to get to Frodo.
Gosh.
But seriously, looking at the technology, I mean, we went from comics to books to radio to television to movies. I mean, it's just been a progression where we're taking all of our knowledge and literature that we've had, and we've now put it in other tangible forms for us to experience. And now we're repeating that. We're going to get to a point where those are no longer worthy of repeating. We're going to have to go on to something new.
I'm curious to know where you think that's going to go. Because I think that the media has changed, undeniably. Media has evolved, but ultimately compelling characters, relevant issues, interesting plot, that's storytelling 101, whether you're Shakespeare, Tolkien, or Brandon Sanderson. I don't think that the process is going to evolve because of what we're ultimately trying to do. So whoever figures out a way to tell a new story, I think it's the medium is what's going to make a larger impact, because I'm curious to know what anyone thinks the evolution of storytelling is going to be. You have people diagramming different arcs. I can't tell you how many different ways I've heard people just come up with a new phrase for the 3-act structure, and I chuckle like, okay, you can call it that, but someone who knows what that is going to be, oh, well, it's call it whatever you want. Storytelling is storytelling.
Does anyone else have that? Kids come home with the English assignments and they see the 3 arcs. I point it to my kids and I'm like, see that, guys? Yeah, you remember that, because it doesn't go away. It doesn't. It's the same.
I think we're probably going to see people trying to reinvent and to put a new spin and to reinvent the hero's journey or the fool's journey, and just come up with new things, but eventually we're probably just going to return to the old or the original, maybe. It's sort of like the whole thing about, our ebooks going to trump regular books, and that tension, but the regular books aren't going to go away, the physical, tangible books. And I think that applies to Tolkien and others like him, and the, I don't want to say old ways of doing it, but I guess what I'm trying to say is reinvention will only go so far before we're back where we started.
In full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, Weech. I don't know that it will ever be fully redone or something new is going to come out of it, but I think that eventually someone is going to scream loud enough that it's going to silence, I guess, the forefathers of fantasy. You're going to have either, George R.R. Martin or somebody's works become this new idea where it's now more character perspectives, more blending the rights and wrongs in fantasy, and that kind of take off on a whole nother sprout, so that we all know who Tolkien is, much like we know who Aristotle is, but so long ago we don't rarely quote him as much as we do now.
That's absolutely true. Time eventually gets everyone, and sooner or later someone will retake the throne, and you see it more commonly in music. You look at what people do, and music is a lot more finite in terms of people, but you get to someone who's educated enough, they're like, no, that was Hendrix, or no, that was the Beatles. And in literature, because it's such a more permanent medium, people latch on to that more. But I think someone will eventually do something. I would not have been surprised if it would have been Rowling. I would not have been surprised if it had been Martin or Rothfuss. But until I think what made Tolkien so much easier to latch on to was he came alongside history, and when you have that relevance, it associates a lot like with the 60s and the music of the 60s. When you align entertainment and art with history and relevance, that's when you get those trendsetters. That's when you get those people that people latch down into history and say, this was someone who contributed to the world.
You see, I think in a way certain fantasy writers have with Tolkien, not that I think necessarily anyone more than Tolkien, but what they've done is they've done it in certain fantasy subcategories or genres. So we say about J.K. Rowling, yes, but that's for young adult, or that's for, so, or you say with urban fantasy, you might say Gaiman for hit, or you might say for dark fantasy, you might say Anne Rice if you're talking for vampires. So it's, I think because there are these very specific genres now, it gets harder to say one person in fantasy, because these people might become super well known, super successful, super critically acclaimed, but you're doing it in a much more niche area. So I think people have done and will, but you're going to do it in a much more niche area of fantasy, rather than just, oh, that's the person of fantasy, or that's the king of fantasy, or that's the queen of fantasy. You kind of don't do that anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, I'd agree. And now we have space operas coming out, which is the new big thing. Everybody's writing a space opera, which is that.
It's interesting because, I mean, rewind the clock. H.G. Wells is the father of science fiction. He is still the father of science fiction. And Jules Verne is his only competitor. And I don't know how you feel about it. I picked up Jules Verne and I went, I'm sorry, he's French lit. He is not sci-fi. He is French lit all the way. And one of the things that we were talking about with Tolkien, he released his books during 1936, you said, Josh?
I think you corrected me, actually. Did you say it was 20s?
Well, no, Worm of Arboros was 1926. But
okay,
we are looking at World War II was happening at that time. And the world was at war. We had Hitler sweeping the continent, sweeping Europe. The bad guy winning.
It was 1939 to 1945 World War II.
Thank you.
If that was the date, yeah.
Yep, thank you. So it was prior to that, there was the mentality of that country, of the world, was different. And I think they needed Frodo. I think they absolutely needed Frodo at that time period. And I think that's partly why we clung to him like we did, was because we needed reassurance that the little guy can trump the greater evil. And whether or not Tolkien meant for that to be his message, that's exactly what the people needed for that time period.
We need Frodo now. Are you kidding me? We need him now.
I was just getting ready to say, you guys better not be wishing any more major catastrophes worldwide for us to just make Jesse play out.
I think we have enough major catastrophes going on right now.
I was thinking I could have used him for 9/11. That's when I would have liked to have seen Frodo around, but yeah, I feel better about today. So
I think the next step, though, because you mentioned the world today, I think the next step in fantasy is not necessarily more realistic protagonists. In Tolkien's time, we wanted to see the little guy. We needed a little bit of symbology, but I think if I were going to hedge my bet on who's going to find something, and that's where your anti-heroes come from, I think where they're going to go is the world's waiting for a hero that doesn't look like a hero. The world's waiting for, the firefighters in 9/11. The world's looking for the average person that can aspire to be great. And I think that's where the clever writer is going to go. I should probably go outline right now.
Yeah, I've got a few things in my head. I'm like, I need to write this down before.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because going back to Tolkien and World War II and World War I, nobody wanted to see it from the Germans' point of view. They saw them and the opposing side as purely evil, and that was the world now. But then you come today, and we're all about seeing the other person's point of view. And I think that had a real influence on fantasy, and I think we're probably going to see more of that. And I agree with Weech. We kind of need that hero who kind of just comes out of nowhere, and we weren't expecting them, and somebody who just kind of came from nothing and nowhere.
Well, that's why Camelot and King Arthur still remain popular, is because you have the boy who came from nowhere and turned out to be the king.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the fantasy of every little child, every one of them. Harry Potter, who did not wish that they were not adopted? That was, please tell me I'm adopted. This isn't my real family at one point. Maybe I'm a secret prince somewhere, and somebody's going to come along and tell me that I'm something better than I am. That is something that I think we have wanted for thousands of years. We are still wanting that. Some affirmation somewhere that we are special.
Yeah. Well, there's no way you and I were going to get through a conversation without mentioning Doctor Who, and that was never going to happen. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But
Doctor Who's all about,
it's been running through my head, and I'm just
what Doctor Who does is, the show isn't about the Doctor. The show's about the companions, and what he does better than any storytelling out there is he shows the world why normal people are special. Went a little extreme with your Clara Oswalds and your Rose Tylers, but at the end of the day, these companions are shown to be special and wonderful and compelling just for who they are, and I think that's a step in the direction I'm looking at.
Did you?
I think wasn't it in one of the Christmas specials where the Doctor? It was the Matt Smith Doctor who said that in his entire 1,000 years of living, he had not met a single person who wasn't important.
Yeah. Have you seen Classic Who?
I've seen some Classic Who. I get back to the Fourth Doctor is about as far back as I go.
Classic Who is about the Doctor. You don't start seeing the companions really do anything. Okay, Sarah Jane, but really it's about the Doctor. The companions start making that emphasis later on when they come in with Rose Tyler. My girlfriend watched from 2005 on, and I started all the way back in 1963 and watched in chronological order. And she was adamant that it was all about the companions, and the Doctor was the one who went in and out where you stayed with the companions. And when I finally got to 2005, I saw what she meant. Prior to 2005, you stayed with the Doctor. The Doctor was the stationary one. You were the one living on the TARDIS, right there along with her, going, what is this rumpage you keep bringing home? You were right there with the TARDIS and with the Doctor. And then when 2005 happened, they swapped those roles. So you were suddenly the companion experiencing the Doctor. And for me, still where I am now, I know the past. I know I can see all his life all the way from the last 50 years. So I have the information that his companions are lacking. So when he makes a joke, I get it, whereas his companions don't. So I think that's why I relate a lot more to the Doctor, and I see it from his point of view than the companion's point of view. But one of the things I wanted to mention is talk about your heroes going from great to evil. And I'm going to David Tennant when he, I cannot remember the group, the alien group, when he punishes them, sentences them. What he does, he crosses some serious lines. And it leaves me with David Tennant's character at the end of that episode going, okay, he has definitely crossed. Like, he is no longer good. And you see that again with, prior with Christopher Eccleston's character. When he went after the Dalek, he sounded just like a Dalek at one point. And again, the Dalek said it best, you would make a great Dalek. So really, it's a step back and you go, okay, at what point did the hero cross that line? Did he become like his enemies? The Doctor does have a streak of absolute evil in him that he, I think at times, really struggles keeping in check.
That's a plot thread that I'm very intrigued by. The me and Josh are racing towards space opera, whatnot. He'll beat me. I'm not worried about it. But the idea of drifting into evil.
Yeah.
One of my favorite little phrases I tell my friends a lot is, the devil's your best friend.
Mm-hmm.
The devil's not some huge monster with horns that scares everybody. The devil's the guy who looks at you and be like, no, I can understand that. Yeah. That's understandable. Anyone would do that. And so when you look at people drifting into it, and that ties back into the desire for redemption, because every time the Doctor takes a step too far, which is why Donna's so underrated, because Donna's the one that smacked him on the nose and said, you're drifting away from the man that you're supposed to be. And so having that relationship, having someone who can bring him back, and it shows you how on the edge is, which is, if we're going off on a Doctor Who tangent, and we are because I'm here, I found it unfortunate, and I hope that in this next season, what I really wanted was for Capaldi to go a step too far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one of the things you want to see, that absolute, the absolute epitome of the Doctor's evil is the 6th episode. I'm sorry, the 6th Doctor. He really, television and storytelling during that time period really went dark. It did turn very dark, and they started exploring with how the public would respond to seeing torture on television, and it became very, very violent. It was, I'm trying to figure out the time period, it's not 70s, it was mid-70s, and you saw a lot of violence suddenly creep into television. And the Doctor, when he was in his 6th regeneration, did a lot with the violence and the evil, and he really... It's interesting how you again see him teetering on that good versus evil, that hero versus the anti-hero, and there is one episode where he does confront Satan himself, and they have this very conversation.
Yeah.
So
I think Capaldi's Doctor, which I have not watched much of, but I remember that episode with Clara where she essentially has been killed. He doesn't want to let her go, so he breaks all of his rules just to hang on to her, and I think it's a part of his kind of spiral into not really, but it's that tension, that dance between good and evil, and what he wants versus good for the universe. This thing that you see a lot throughout the show.
mm-hmm. We have a few people who need to step out, so we're going to go ahead. I'm going to end this recording. We're going to wrap this up, and I do want to say thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.